Attention! None piece of information in this movie is of historical value and should not be treated as one. The knowledge presented here is based on biblical and theological studies that is strictly connected with spiritual perception. Western part of Jordan. Abarim is a part of a wider mountain range known as the Abarim Mountains. It stretches along Jordan's western border with Israel. One of the peaks of the Abarim Mountains, Mount Tabor, remains a very important place, especially for Judaism followers. After 430 years of Egyptian enslavement and another 40 years of wandering the wilderness of the deadly Sinai Desert, Israelites, under the command of Moses, the man appointed by the God of the Old Testament around 1,300 years before the birth of Christ, reached their promised land, the land of milk and honey, a paradise they are destined to settle in. Moses wasn't supposed to enter their long-sought land. It was his God's punishment for striking the rock instead of speaking towards it in search of water. As a result of this act of objection against God's will, the Israelite spiritual leader brought them to their promised land, but he didn't see it himself. According to Almighty's will, it was done by Moses' religious successor, Joshua. Moses himself dies at the foot of Mount Tabor to be buried on its peak. The 9th century BCE, Ancient Israel. 500 years after Moses' death, in ancient Israel, in the town of Tishbe, was born a man called Eliah. His name in Hebrew means God is my salvation, or God is the Lord. As a grown-up man, Eliah is a prophet. He doesn't have a place to stay, wandering from place to place. In his journeys, Eliah is called by his God to meet King Ahab, the ruler of the northern kingdom of Israel, to bring him the devastating news about the coming of a deadly drought. The prophet claimed that the drought would cause widespread famine. Why did the Israeli prophet, a man who was a nuisance for the king of the northern Israel, decide to warn the ruler, although King Ahab and his wife, Queen Jezebel, followed Baal cult? Various Semitic peoples where Eliah lived and preached worshipped many gods. The Old Testament term of Baal referred not to one specific deity, but many local gods and goddesses, and that changed depending on the region and time. Baal could come in many forms and possess various attributes. Baals were guardian deities of different spheres of life, like rain, harvest, fertility, or war. In ancient Semitic languages of the Middle East, the term Baal meant lord or ruler. It was thus used to describe multiple Canaanite deities staying in opposition to the Hebrew Jehovah. Eliah is sent by his God to warn the king against the coming disaster, thus proving the existence of Jehovah's and his will. Baal cult stayed in opposition to all Israeli beliefs, and that inevitably led to religious conflicts. As a result of one of them, in order to prove the existence of Jehovah and discredit Baal cult, Jezebel polytheism is put to the test. In the face of a lasting drought, Eliah prays for the rain, which finally comes. This event is an example of Eliah's prophetic role. The most known event in the Old Testament is a moment when Eliah decides to challenge the prophets of Baal on Mount Carmel. In Aramaic, The name Carmel means God's vineyard. Mount Carmel lies close to the city of Haifa by the Mediterranean in the northern part of Israel. In times described in the Old Testament, the confrontation was meant to define which God is real and which one is just a figment of imagination. The book of 1 Kings describes the miracle as follows. The prophet Elijah faces the 400 prophets of Baal, challenging them to prepare their offering and ask their God to burn it on the altar. The prophets of Baal pray for many hours, but to no avail. When Elijah takes turn, the prophet prepares the altar for his god Jehovah, moisturizes the offering, the altar and the area around with water, and starts praying to Jehovah. After a very short prayer, a huge fire falls down, turning everything into ashes. After this victory, Elijah orders to catch the prophets of Baal, lead the captives to the river Kishon, where they are all killed. The book of 1 Kings describes the event as follows. Then Elijah commanded them, "Seize the prophets of Baal, don't let anyone get away." They seized them, and Elijah had them brought down to the Kishon valley and slaughtered there. All this was meant to cleanse Israel of Baal cult followers. It is worth stating that the Old Testament is full of examples of religious killings. Did Elijah, after the slaughter of Baal prophets, take vengeance for the persecution from polytheism supporters? Did he have blood on his hands? Is it possible in any way to justify such type of behavior, which in our times is called bestiality? According to the Old Testament, Queen Jezebel persecuted Jehovah's followers in many ways, destroying Jehovah places of worship, murdering the prophets, or persecution and repressions against those who didn't want to become the followers of Baal. In the face of such a behavior, Elijah seems to follow the tooth-for-tooth principle. After the Baal prophets' slaughter, Queen Jezebel orders to capture and kill Elijah. Facing the danger, the prophet escapes to the desert, where his god Jehovah provides him with food and shelter. The description of the help can be found in the book 1 of Kings. He went and lived by the brook Cherith, and the ravens brought him bread and meat, and he drank from the brook. After all those events, Elijah made a prophecy regarding the king Ahab and Queen Jezebel's death. Because they committed numerous sins, including iniquity and violence towards Jehovah's followers, King Ahab will die in combat, his wife Jezebel will suffer a humiliating death, and her body will be devoured by dogs. The prophecy on the king and queen fulfilled. Throughout all his life, the prophet Elijah appeared as a precursor of the future Messiah. That was why his mission consisted in calling for acceptance of faith in the only one God Jehovah and abandoning polytheism. The role of Elijah as a prophet was to prepare people for the coming of salvation. At the end of his earthly service, Elijah didn't die but was taken to heaven by the fiery vortex. Jerusalem, the 5th century BCE. The Catholic Old Testament comprises of 46 books. The author of one of them is believed to be a prophet who lived and preached in Jerusalem in the 5th century BCE, although his name appears in the book only once. The Lord's speech through Malachi. Researchers don't agree in terms of the prophet's name etymology. Was Malachi the true name of the prophet, his title, or the role of God's messenger attributed to the book by the author himself? In Hebrew, the name Malachi means Jehovah is the messenger. According to the legend, Malachi was born in the town of Sophah and came from the family of Zabulon. Zabulon, in turn, was the founder of one of the 12 generations of Israel, which made Malachi somewhat exceptional. In adulthood, as a monk, Malachi condemned marriages with foreigners, witchcraft, adultery, perjury, and oppression of the weaker. Malachi also made prophecies in the context of the New Testament Transfiguration. One of them was the prophecy about the coming of Elijah, who will appear on earth before the day of the Lord, and the researchers interpret it as a symbol of the future salvation. According to a different prophecy, a Messiah will come to people, but before, a messenger will be born to prepare the road for the Messiah. The messenger was supposed to be John the Baptist. Apart from that, the author of the book called for members of the priesthood state to improve. He criticized them for neglecting their duties and focusing too much on formalized side of religion. The prophet foretold the coming of the day of the Lord as a judgment day, when the Lord of heavens will come to judge people for their deeds. According to the Bible, Malachi died at the young age and was buried in a family tomb on the slope of the Olive Mountain. It lies in the eastern part of Jerusalem, separating the city from the Judean desert. Its slope reveals the view of Jerusalem, with a characteristic golden dome on a rock. It was here where, in pre-Christian times, Jehovah was worshipped. It was here where Jesus went to heaven after the resurrection, and that is why this place is so much holy for Christians. "400 years later, in a small town of Bethlehem, Jesus Christ is born. Christians will call him the Son of God, and religion will start to write a new book, which will survive the next 2,000 years. The New Testament appears. Nazareth, the beginning of the Christian era. As a grown-up man, Jesus, contrary to the times of blood and vengeance, which the Old Testament is soaked in, starts to promote the forgiveness-based approach. The Gospel of St. Matthew reads, "Whosoever smite thee on thy right cheek, turn to him the other also." The Old Testament God of vengeance and cruelty vanishes without a trace. Jesus is bringing with him a new order, preaching throughout Galilee and the whereabouts. As a wandering prophet, he gathers his disciples around him. Some of them are simple fishermen. Matthew, one of them, was a tax collector before joining Jesus. Others were ordinary craftsmen recruited from simple people. Until his death, Jesus preaches and spreads his views. After about 2 years, something extraordinary takes place, which will seal others' perception on him and his mission. Mount Tabor. On the eastern end of the Jezreel Valley, in the southern part of Galilee, at the height of 588 meters above sea level, rises a lonely mountain, Mount Tabor. Covered in forest, this area is part of the Tabor Mountain National Park. 2,000 years ago, at the beginning of the Christian era, at the time of Jesus of Nazareth, in Palestine appears a man foretold by prophets. The man lives a life eating locust and honey. Some know him as John and nickname him the Baptist. The man is the embodiment of the prophetic teachings of the Old Testament Elijah, the fulfillment of his role as the one who 900 years earlier prepared people for the coming of half God, half man. John the Baptist is only a messenger, claiming his secondary role, saying, "One who is more powerful than I will come, the straps of whose I am not worthy to untie." At the beginning of his messianic activity, Jesus becomes baptized in the river Jordan. The baptism, the dove in the air, and the voice from heaven saying, "This is my beloved Son with whom I am well pleased," is a turning moment. Jesus' acceptance of his role as the Savior of the world. We can find the story in the Gospels of Matthew and John. After being baptized in the River Jordan, Jesus with his followers wanders spreading his teachings of love. After around 2 years, he takes with him 3 of his disciples, Peter, Jacob, and John, to climb Mount Tabor. Why did Jesus choose just that mountain? Geology of the area proves that it is a lonely volcano, far away from hills and any other mountain ranges. The mountain is located quite close to the city of Nazareth, and that was where Jesus preached his teachings. On the basis of the geography and history of the region, one can assume that in the vicinity of the mountain, a few communication and trade routes crisscrossed. One of them was Via Maris, the Sea Road, an ancient trade route connecting Egypt and Mesopotamia. Near Mount Tabor, there was also a frequently used route from Galilee to Judea. The third, a major communication route, was Via Jezreel, an ancient route going through Jezreel Valley in southern Galilee, connecting various regions of Palestine. All those factors could have exerted influence on Jesus' decision to choose just Mount Tabor. Thus, he takes with him 3 of his disciples, Jacob and John, 2 sons of Zebedee, and Peter, nicknamed Cephas. In the Gospel of New Testament, Jacob and John are also called the sons of thunder, which may suggest their enthusiasm and zeal in Jesus' spiritual service. Many years after his master's death, Jacob's brother John will write his gospel in the city of Ephesus. Aramaic Simon Peter's nickname Cephas means the rock. The third of the disciples witnessing Jesus' transfiguration was one of the most important figures. By calling Simon Peter the rock, Jesus said that on that rock he would build his church. Why did Jesus take with him those 3? There are no clear reasons in this respect in the Bible. Moreover, we will not find the exact time of the beginning of the Transfiguration, and most probably it is not the point. The Transfiguration on Mount Tabor was a spiritual event above all, showing Jesus' divine identity and his glory, and time doesn't matter in this case. Peter, Jacob, and John's presence was supposed to strengthen their faith and prepare them to the traumatic events related to their master's passion and death, which they didn't cope anyway, fleeing in panic on the day of his capture. The Gospel of Matthew reads that after Jesus and his disciples climbed Mount Tabor, he transfigured in front of them, his face shone like the sun, and his clothes became as white as light. Soon next to Jesus appeared 2 luminous figures. Moses, the one that 1,300 years earlier led the Israelites out of the Egyptian enslavement, Malachi, the priest and the prophet, 400 years earlier announcing the coming of Christ, and Elijah, the prophet who 900 years earlier also announced the coming of half-God, half-man. All 3 of them were shining with equally blinding light, which terrified their disciples. Jesus, Moses, and Elijah were talking together for some time, but the apostles either didn't hear them or were so terrified that they couldn't pay attention. When Moses, Elijah, and Jesus finished their conversation, the disciples could hear the voice from heaven that said, "This is my Son whom I love. With him I am very pleased." These same words were said on the day of Jesus' baptism in Jordan, when a dove appeared in the sky. When everything came to an end, Jesus ordered his disciples to keep in secret everything they saw until his resurrection. A German mystic living in the 19th century, Anne Catherine Emmerich, in her visions, described the events on Mount Tabor as if she had been there in person. Here is a shortened version of her personal report of the event. On the day of Transfiguration, Jesus, together with his disciples, visited an inn near Hadad Rimmon. The town was supposed to be close to Megiddo Plain. It is identified with the present-day city of Rummana, around 7 kilometers east of today's Megiddo. Leaving the inn, all four of them went towards the town of Kislot Tabor or Kaslot, identified with today's Iksal, which was at the border of the land of Zabulon, lying at the foot of Mount Tabor. A crowd of travelers from Jerusalem gathered around Jesus, so he preached and healed a few sick ones. Before climbing up towards the peak, Jesus sent most of his disciples in the area to preach, leaving with him 3 of them, Peter, John, and Jacob the elder, and the 4 started hiking. It took them almost 2 hours to climb to the top, because Jesus stopped on the way in caves and grottos where prophets lived to talk to them and pray. From the top they could see a beautiful view, and the earth was covered with fragrant herbs and flowers. The 4 hikers went into the natural grotto, resembling the one on Olive Mountain, but this time the passage changed into a small cave. They prayed there again, and their master told them about their creation and salvation. Jesus said that he wanted to show them his true nature, and that they would see him cloaked in glory, in order to strengthen their faith in him when he would be hanging on the cross, despised and desecrated, stripped of all honor. After the sunset, his body was beginning more and more luminous, and an unearthly play of light began to dance around, testifying to the presence of angelic spirits. When Peter asked what it could mean, Jesus said that those luminous creations were serving him. A moment later, streams of wonderful fragrances flowed on them, showing them a foretaste of heavenly delights. Meanwhile, the figure of Jesus himself lit up more and more until it became almost transparent. And a circle of light so bright formed around them as if the day had come. Then, at midnight, the luminous glow reached its apogee, and from heaven a trail of light came along, on which some angels were flowing down and some others were rising upwards. Suddenly, 3 luminous figures entered the light circle, as if they came out of the dark. 2 of them, of clear human shapes, started a conversation with Jesus. They were Moses and Elijah. The third, an ethereal figure resembling a ghost rather than a human being, was remaining silent all the time. It was Malachi. They all talked about the atonement of sins and his future torments. Moses expressed his joy at seeing the one who led the Israelites out of enslavement and now wants to offer them redemption. Jesus was telling them about his past and future sufferings, describing his torments in detail, and they consoled him. They felt sorry for him and thanked God for all that. When he described being nailed to the cross, he spread his arms as if to make a point. So shall the Son of Man be lifted up. When everything was all over, Moses and Elijah headed east, Malachi to the west, and the area was once again plunged into the darkness of the night. When the apostles regained consciousness from the shock and realized what had happened, a luminous cloud like morning mist descended from the sky. The heavens opened above Jesus and the Holy Trinity appeared. The Heavenly Father, as an old man, was sitting on the throne, and at his feet angels were dancing. A stream of light flowed down on Jesus, and the apostles could hear a voice soft like a stream. "This is my Son whom I love. With him I am well pleased." The apostles were so terrified that they fell with their faces to the ground, aware of their fragility. After some time, Jesus lifted them up and calmed them down, telling them not to be afraid. Meanwhile, it was 3 in the morning, and the dawn was getting closer. Jesus told them that they had just witnessed the transfiguration of the Son of Man, to strengthen their faith, so that they would not falter when they see him delivered into the hands of the torturers for the sins of the world. Turning to Peter, Jesus said that he was the first to recognize God in him, and so, as on a rock, he would build his church on it. When the dawn was breaking, they descended the mountain along the western slope. Along the way, Jesus forbade them to speak of what had happened until his resurrection. Anne Catherine Emmerich's visions concerning the life of Jesus became important elements of her mystical experiences. However, theologians and researchers do not always refer favorably to them because of the fact that they were written not by her alone, but by other authors, and are treated more like her personal experiences without any reference points found in the Bible. Was it there on Mount Tabor, where an Old Testament mission and the New Testament approach to salvation became one? Did the ancient Jehovah change his mind from being an envious, destroying his enemies ruler, and sealed his decision to send his only Son onto the earth to suffer martyrdom on behalf of all people? Does the Bible provide information on the topic, or do these issues remain a matter of pure speculation and subjective interpretation? After his transfiguration and descent, Jesus healed the demon-possessed boy because his disciples were not able to do it. It was supposed to be the teaching on the importance of faith in the context of words, "Go, your faith has healed you." These words and their meaning bring a very deep message and are the subject for another movie. Jesus continued teachings about his martyrdom, but his disciples often didn't understand their meaning, so he told them about it in parables. In one of them, the parable about the Savior, Jesus tells them about himself as the one who has to suffer and die, but who will ultimately resurrect, and that will be the victory over death. During the Last Supper, Jesus institutes the Eucharist, during which he speaks about his flesh and blood as a sin offering. Moreover, he refers to the prophecies of the Old Testament predicting his suffering and death. Ultimately, the Transfiguration has, or at least should have, great importance for Christians. Apart from Jesus' divine identity, it is an announcement of his resurrection. It connects with the Old Testament prophecies of Elijah about the coming of the Messiah, long awaited by Israel. Jesus is to be the fulfillment of the prophecies and predictions of the Old Testament. The greatest and the most important message of the Transfiguration on Mount Tabor is an encouragement to strive for holiness and personal spiritual transformation to change our lives into the image of Jesus. Almost 2,000 years have passed since the events described. For believers, Jesus is a truly historical figure. Skeptics at most pay attention to the spiritual dimension of the events described, often denying Jesus' existence as a flesh and blood man. Regardless of both of these approaches, not only today's world seems far from the spiritual ideas contained in the Bible. For these 2,000 years, religion as a system of beliefs, in too many cases, has been used as a means to gain power and kill people in the name of God. An argument can be made that over the course of those 20 centuries, the world was constantly changing, and it forced people living in different epochs to appropriately change their behavior to adapt to circumstances. All this time seems to prove that if after his transfiguration on the Mount Tabor, Jesus died on the cross for other people's sins, all his effort was wasted. When studying history, we can help but be impressed as if this statement shifted responsibility for our own deeds to the man hanging on the cross, who is the embodiment of divine love for so many. Jesus' words about turning the other cheek were as if erased from collective memory. Jesus, unlike the Old Testament God of vengeance, doesn't order us to kill other people, and a few dozens or a few thousand years since his martyrdom were enough for the world to plunge into the chaos of wars, murder and bloodshed. When Christianity became the state religion, those who had previously suffered persecution for their faith began the systematic murder of people of other faiths, calling them pagans. In a short time, Constantine completely Christianized the state apparatus. Monks had gained a reputation of professional warriors in the fight against Satan. From Mesopotamia to North Africa, a wave of religious violence engulfed cities and villages. In 388 CE, monks burned the synagogue on the Euphrates. In 391, the Patriarch of Alexandria called on the monks to cleanse the cities of the great temple of Serapis. The bands of monks patrolled the cities of Upper Egypt, ransacking the houses of pagan nobles in search of the statues of gods. In North Africa, wandering monks armed with clubs they called Israelites sneaked up on large estates, screaming praise to God, which was much more terrifying than the roar of a predator. In 415, the Egyptian monks shocked public opinion with lynching the great lady of Alexandria, Hypatia. For the pagans, terrified by that unexpected wave of terrorism, it was the end of the world. During the Crusades for 200 years, the number of people murdered in the name of God cannot be accurately estimated to this day. The Inquisition spread fear, death and destruction for over 600 years. Opinions regarding the estimated number of victims are still the subject of scientific research and discussion. Some researchers claim that the number of victims during that period, mainly women, can be estimated at several hundred thousand. Over time, religious wars turned into ethnic wars, and people were killing one another without restraint. It is enough to mention the nightmare of the 20th century Holocaust. Recently, in the so-called civilized world, extremely fanatical views have been gaining ground regarding, for example, people of different sexual orientation. And it's just a tip of the iceberg. Was this what Jesus meant? Did he realize what would happen after his earthly death from the time of the Transfiguration, dying on the cross? Are we, the people of the 20th century, capable of boldly looking inside ourselves and see there the one who preached and taught about the love to other people and turning the other cheek? The questions are multiplying, and the number of people having the courage to ask them is decreasing from generation to generation.